Hi, everybody. We're going to get started in just a minute or two to let some people filter in. In the meantime, feel free to check out some of our upcoming talks. We have Dr. Ruben Laukonen from the Free University of Amsterdam to discuss how predictive processing frameworks can help explain how brain states change during different kinds of meditation. And then we will also have Dr. Jay Sebelius from UCSF to discuss how they're using psychedelics to treat trauma in transgender populations, and also in general how psychedelic psychotherapy is going to change the field of psychiatry and what the job description in that field is. So those should be very interesting. Also, in the distant future, we have Sutton King, one of the founders of Journey Collab, which is a business synthesizing, making synthetic mescaline in order to kind of divert, tourist interests in peyote, so that the active ingredient can be for sale in capitalist markets, while the actual plant can be continued to use in sacred rituals. So all of these should be really interesting, sampling from a really wide array of psychedelic science and psychedelic, industry as well. So, all right, welcome. For those of you who are new to Crowdcast, we will be using the Ask a Question button at the bottom of the screen. For people who want to ask questions, you can enter it there and we can upvote on the audience's favorites, and I will ask them to Josh at the end. Also, if you will be needing closed captions today, there is a button at the bottom of the screen that should redirect you, that should open another window that, if you're playing this talk out loud, should automatically play closed captions for you. So that's good. Am I breaking up, Josh? I am on my screen.
A little bit. Your video is a little broken, but I can hear you perfectly.
All right. That should be fine. I'll speak slowly so as not to overwhelm the computer. Okay. So now welcome to the third installment of New and Noteworthy in Psychedelic Science. Joshua Falcon is a PhD candidate of Anthropology in the Department of Global and Sociocultural Studies at Florida International University. His research interests are broadly centered on philosophically and critically exploring cross-cultural understandings of human-nature relations. And currently, his work takes an interdisciplinary approach to the political and ethical dimensions of drug use through investigating the effects of psychedelic experiences on human-environment relations. In bringing contemporary scientific research on psychedelics into conversation with theoretical frameworks drawn from the social sciences, such as biopower, decoloniality, and critical posthumanism, Josh's work attempts to reinvigorate traditional conversations within the social sciences, while also providing a novel understanding of the role that psychedelics play in the development of human-environment relations. I'm really excited for this talk because I don't think that neuroscientists and psychiatrists get exposed enough, and as much as they should, to the social sciences and how theoretical frameworks in the social sciences inform the questions we ask in our research. So I'm really excited for this talk. Take it away, Josh.
Thank you. Thanks so much for the introduction as well. And hi, everyone. I'm going to probably just share my screen in a minute so you don't have to see me. It's so large on your screen. But like Sophie said, I have a background in philosophy, and then I have a master's in religious studies, and then now I'm getting a degree in global and social cultural studies. So I'm kind of all over the place, and I'm in the anthropology track, though. In my program, it's interdisciplinary in the sense that we're exposed to sociology, geographic methods from human geography, and also anthropology. So in that sense, I've been exposed to a wide range of theory. And let's see if I can share my screen here. All right. So for today's talk, what I'm really focusing on is how can contemporary theory and anthropology be brought into conversation with psychedelic research. And so this is something that kind of builds off of my master's thesis. And my master's thesis tried to argue that, psychedelics had ethical import, which meant that there were ethical implications to not necessarily the use of psychedelics, but the ethical implications of, can they change people's ethics? Can they change people's values? Can psychedelics change people's ways of relating to one another? And so I kind of used William James to argue that psychedelics could create new live options for people. So William James had this idea of live options, and that they were beliefs that somebody could actually incorporate into their life and guide their behavior. And I said, well, psychedelic experiences seem to create certain occasions and certain experiences experiences where people will say that this changed my life, or now I believe in this. And so I might get into some of this in this talk, but for this talk, pretty much this is the overview of what I'm going to be speaking about. So I hope I'm not insulting anybody's intelligence in giving an overview of anthropology. I know that's not what most people are interested in, but I think it's kind of important to say a couple of words really quick on the discipline of anthropology and kind of where it came from and what it studies and what are the theoretical approaches that have been developed in anthropology. And then I'll move into, because my way of studying psychedelics within anthropology has been very strange, because a lot of my advisors and people in my department would be like, you're doing a psychology project, you're doing a psychiatry project, you don't really belong here in the social sciences. And so and I found through my writing my exams, which I'll be presenting here, where anthropologists kind of fit within the study of psychedelics. And so to do that, you kind of have to say how anthropologists have studied drugs, then how they've studied psychedelics, and then after that, I kind of get into three theoretical fields that I've kind of brought research on psychedelics into conversation with. With that being said, I focus on mostly the classic psychedelics, which you see on your screen. I haven't gone into research on ketamine, on MDMA, because it's just too expansive. It's too much. And my current dissertation project actually is exploring the experiences, how psychedelic experiences influence human nature relations or human non-human relations. And so part of that project involves conducting 40 interviews with individuals from Miami and seeing what their experiences were like and how they impacted their lives. But I'm also analyzing online experience reports, and that's something that I'll be speaking about as well. But as far as like primary data is concerned, I don't have so much primary data. I just have a small case study I've done, and I have my master's thesis and my current dissertation project, so I can give some preliminary findings on that. But really what I've been doing in these first 4 years in grad school is engaging with dominant theory and trying to see what are psychedelics, how do they speak to that. So I gotta calm down. So anthropology, what does it refer to? So some people say that it's the study of human cultures. Cultures is a problematic term because sometimes it's used in an essentialized form to kind of predict what a certain community is in a stagnant way, not in a fixed way, but really kind of like what this book says is anthropology is the exploration of human diversity. And so the main methods that are used in anthropology are ethnography and participant observation. So really just spending time with individuals, as much time as possible, really, to find out what a community is like, what meanings they make, what their everyday practices are like. And so it's just immersing oneself in another culture. Usually another culture is kind of what anthropology has been focused on. The other, alterity is sometimes what they refer to it as. But yeah, and so anthropology comes out of a colonial history, like many of our disciplines, unfortunately. And the early thinkers really sought to, apply scientific laws and regularities to social phenomena. And so the kind of transition anthropology has gone through has really been from, like prejudiced, racist origins where people would just kind of analyze, explore kind of like field notes and make generalizations about cultures, like Lewis Henry Morgan, which kind of created this hierarchy of cultures where he placed indigenous people at the lowest end as savages up, and then they say society progressed from savagery to barbarism up through civilization. And if you can guess, who did he put at the pinnacle of civilization? Well, it was European, society. And so from there, we really have a lot of transitions in anthropology that there's kind of a self-reflexivity saying, hold on, wait, that wasn't the best way to go about things. And so Franz Boas talks about how, one needs to study the history of a particular culture. Malinowski talks about how one needs to really immerse oneself in a culture to understand it for a long period of time. And then Claude Lévi-Strauss kind of came with this linguistic/cognitive approach to studying myths and thinking that he could still find universal, cognitive models of humans. And so there's still this idea of applying scientific, I don't know what you would call it, method, or not necessarily the method, but the kind of theory in theorizing to social phenomena. And then we have Clifford Geertz, who talks about meaning making. And then we have the more contemporary anthropology, which is post-colonial. It investigates the legacy of colonialism and imperialism. The ontological turn, which the word ontology means a study of being or what exists. And so anthropologists exploring that idea. And then we have more than human and decolonial. I'll probably talk about those a little bit. So in the process, anthropology's long had a colonial history, but more recently people have started to become more critical of anthropology. So issues of representation. So how is it that this person is representing this other culture without that culture speaking for themselves, right? What is the anthropologist's relation to that subject? How are they producing knowledge about a certain group of people and those people not being allowed to represent or talk about it themselves? It's such a fragmented depiction of that particular culture. So critical scholars have also critiqued the idea of anthropos, this idea of man, the human, right? Or how was that idea even? How did it come about, and what does it signify, and what kind of power relations does it are like inherently, associated with it? And so anthropology has kind of become more critical as time has gone on. Now, when you look at drug studies in anthropology, it's kind of wide ranging, and you have stuff on drug trafficking, the war on drugs, socioeconomic inequalities caused by the war on drugs, drug regulation and security, and then medical anthropology. And medical anthropology is a subdiscipline of anthropology, and it studies cultural concepts of health and illness, and well-being and disease, and how these concepts are different in different societies and how they operate and the meanings that are associated with them. But really, this is what drug studies and anthropology have focused on. In addition to that, like many other drug study fields, it's on the negative aspects of drug use historically. So we have addiction, alcohol, and pharmaceuticals. And I think that the pharmaceutical ones are a little bit more necessary in today's day and age, given the prevalence of pharmaceuticals in society. But when we start getting to psychedelics, and this is part of my exams, right? I did a review of all this to situate myself within the field of anthropology for my professors, because they weren't really sure and they didn't think my project fit in. And so I started discovering when I would search, and so the top anthropology journals like Ethnologist, American Anthropologist, Sociocultural Anthropology, these type of anthropology annual review, these type of journals, I would search psychedelic, I would search entheogen, peyote, ayahuasca, psilocybin, and this is what I kind of came up with. And so I find the earliest studies on peyote, really in psychedelics, the classic psychedelics, I should say, were Ruth Schonland, 1925, and she spoke about the diffusion. She spoke about the peyote ceremonies, the sacramental and healing purposes, and she actually provided some of the earliest descriptions of the phenomenology of peyote visions. And then we have Richard Evans Schultes, who you see on the right, and he was, considered the father of ethnobotany, and he downplayed the visionary aspects highlighted by Schonland of peyote, and he foregrounded the tonic and medicinal aspects of it. Weston LeBar would come around and, publish in 1939, and then later again in 1960, a 25-year review on peyote. And he argued that Schultes kind of not only compartmentalized indigenous ways of living into modern categories, such as medicine, recreation, work, religion, when he says that these categories don't uphold within other worldviews, especially within indigenous worldviews and the communities that he was studying with, the Native Americans. And he also argued against a certain person, Carol Barber, who classified peyote as a narcotic, and he said no, it's a psychotropic. So from the 1925 to really like the 40s up through the 70s, I should say more or less is kind of like the golden age, or I don't know if I should say that, but of peyote research from what I've found in the top anthropology journals. And so we have later works up through the 90s and up into the 2000s, but it's less. And so really we have research on peyote rituals and ceremonies, religion, healing and spirituality, the spiritual healing medicine interface, I call it, because there's a lot of anthropologists, including medical anthropologists, who try to speak about indigenous practices or indigenous healing in terms of Western medicine. And so trying to legitimize what's fundamentally something ontologically different or pragmatically different from what we're used to, and then trying to translate it and describe it in Western terms, which is problematic in certain ways. But it's also, I understand that these anthropologists are trying to legitimize it in another sense. And then so more recently is peyote and politics. There's a Shakruna just shared something recently called the Peyote Files. I think that Keeper Trout is part of. And he speaks a lot about the politics of peyote and conservation and issues like that. And then there's San Pedro. And there's not much on San Pedro, but at least 3 studies that I've found within the major anthropology journals. So when peyote is kind of going down, ayahuasca research is going up in anthropology. And so there's Marlene Dobkin de Rios, which is arguably one of the most important thinkers on ayahuasca. There's Luis Eduardo Luna, who some claim coined the term plant teacher, and I think they might be right, because that's the earliest study I find is in 1984, where he talks about plant teachers. And this is a term that's very prevalent in the psychedelic community today. And he speaks about shamanic healing. And so ayahuasca research is kind of about the same things, but it's also about tourism, right? And so tourism is a big thing that I think that it's a new phenomenon that ayahuasca is making more visible than peyote did for certain historical reasons and geographic reasons and a lot of different reasons. But and so there's different perspectives on tourism. Well, it's in a way fragmenting indigenous ways of living. It's introducing capitalist modes of commerce. It's disrupting traditional modes of being. But then there's also people who say, well, this is actually an opportunity for indigenous groups to collaborate with Westerners, to learn from Westerners and exchange knowledge. And so Beatriz Labate, which is arguably the biggest ayahuasca anthropologist researcher today, I would argue, she kind of makes that claim in certain of her writings. And so beyond that, ayahuasca has been written about this as its spiritual experience, for its ability to cure drug addiction and depression, as a source of knowledge, the commercialization of ayahuasca, and then the therapeutic value. And remember, this is in anthropology, in the major anthropology journals. And so what I found was when I would search LSD and psilocybin, there was not much research going on within the major anthropology journals. And so I found, some 1940s articles, Schultes talking about Tenonacatl in the Aztec context and claiming that it was a narcotic. And Johnson also wrote on psilocybin. But really, we don't have much on LSD or psilocybin. And we have some on prehistory and archaeology. It's definitely more expansive than the one source I have there, but it's not necessarily in the major anthropology journals again. And so some people have written about discourse analysis and connected that to psychedelics. And then a recent study, which actually I think is very well done, is this online digital methods study where they went on to web forums and analyzed trip reports and kind of gathered valuable data from that. And then we have really, I think in psychedelics in general, Michael Winkelmann is probably like the most prolific anthropologist writing. And he's written about shamanism and psychointegration, human evolution, biology, medicine. He's written about almost everything you can think of in terms of psychedelics, but he's very thorough. And I think that he does a good job of integrating multiple disciplinary perspectives and bringing them into conversation with anthropology. So kind of what I came up with, and obviously this chart can be more comprehensive, and I plan to make it more comprehensive, but from what you've seen just in this presentation, you can kind of get a sense of more or less what the representation of psychedelic research is in anthropology. And so we really don't have much on psilocybin or LSD. We had a lot on peyote. It kind of went down, and there's still some research going on, but really as peyote research is going down, research on ayahuasca tended to shoot up. And so like I said, this chart probably could include more studies to make it more comprehensive, but I think I could say without a doubt that since anthropology has always been focused on the other, or focused on alterities, what you could call it, or exoticism, the other culture, the other group, then that kind of reflects how most of the studies have been on peyote and ayahuasca, because they're usually within indigenous contexts, or they're how Westerners are influencing indigenous contexts. And so I think that the areas for anthropological research really are doing ethnographic research in the United States, right? So I mean, yeah, in Europe as well, but for me, it's in the United States. I don't find much research being done. The research that is being done is not in anthropology. It might be in sociology. It might be in public health. It might be in criminal justice, but it's not in anthropology, from what I've seen. The subjective dimensions of drug use. So how do psychedelics shape people's sense of self? How do psychedelics shape people's subjectivity? How can psychedelics inform anthropology? So we have themes in anthropology like human environment relations that people haven't really spoken about psychedelics. And so how can psychedelics inform that? And how can critical theory inform psychedelic research? So, we have critical theories, some of which I'm going to be speaking about now. How can they help inform psychedelic research? And then also, there's a couple of studies that say, yes, we're doing clinical research. We know all these, we know the neural correlates of consciousness through psychedelics. We know how psychedelics affect cognition, how they affect, neurogenesis, but we don't really know out in the open what happens really with psychedelics. People who are at a concert, people who are taking, drinking alcohol with psilocybin and smoking cannabis and maybe taking MDMA. Like, we don't really know what's happening in the real world and how people are really using psychedelics in an uncontrolled or a non-clinical environment, I should say. And so, and then also digital methods, because digital methods is something that there are thousands and thousands and thousands of trip reports online, and there's not that much analysis of them. And so I think that that's an area that people already wrote their experiences. This is something that came from them. They took the time to write it. It wasn't like a survey that came to them. They're kind of predisposed to certain questions. So I think that that's a really valuable resource. Kind of had to rush through that because I have a lot to go. Sorry. So, critical theory. So what is critical theory? So people define critical theory in a narrow sense and in a broad sense. In a narrow sense, it's associated with the Frankfurt School and German scholars that are from the Marxist tradition. And it's kind of oriented towards critical theory, differs from regular theory in the sense that critical theory seeks an emancipation from human slavery, and it acts as a liberating influence. In a broader sense, critical theory is just a systematic and reflexive analysis and critique of both culture and society, and it's used to challenge oppressive power structures. So critical theory is just basically a way, you can say it like in a colloquial way, it's just a way of thinking critically about something instead of taking it for granted. So thinking about the production of knowledge, how is knowledge produced, who's producing it, why are they producing it, who's funding it, to what ends is it being produced, who can co-opt that knowledge. So it's kind of, what other knowledges is that type of knowledge silencing? So it has to do with thinking critically about knowledge, thinking critically about economic systems or social relations. We usually classify this as Marxist, and a lot of people hear Marx and they kind of go crazy, but that's a very powerful form of analysis, of understanding even the dynamics of the psychedelic stock market, right? Well, who are the players that are getting a monopoly on certain patents or not, and so on and so forth. What classes have access to psychedelic medicine, will have access to psychedelic medicine, which classes will not. And so thinking critically about race, gender, power relations, thinking critically about things that we take for granted, like nature, and the environment. I have a professor at my university who's written about, Roderick Newman, who's written about the creation of national parks and how this is really shaped in the imaginary of pristine nature. And pristine nature, if you do a critical post-structuralist analysis of it, is really informed by British landscape excursions and finding this picturesque scene that's completely devoid of humans, and then landscape painting is also influenced by this. And this idea of pristine nature has come to shape the idea of national parks. And then national parks are seen as neo-colonial enterprises that really take indigenous peoples in other countries out of what would be their rightful territories. And so really critical theory is about all these things. Critical post-humanism talks about the human, how is this made? This idea, when did it come about? What purposes did the creation of the human serve? And so on and so forth. And so one critical theorist who's really all over anthropology and the social sciences, some people think for better or for worse. But for me, it's been a powerful, he's been a powerful influence. And so Michel Foucault, and he was a historian, really. Some people consider him to be a philosopher, but to me, he was really a critical historian. And so he used kind of critical methods to go back through historical record and analyze different phenomena in different time periods. So one of the things that Foucault is known for is for exploring how power operates, and how he says that power doesn't just operate in a top-down way, but power operates through discourse, power operates through managing biology, and that power works in different ways. It's not necessarily a top-down, straightforward way. And part of this idea comes from the idea that Foucault thinks that normal analyses of power, or analyses of power up to the time of his writing, had failed to take into account other modes of power, right? And so he says that there's mostly ideas of analyzing power from a Hobbesian perspective. And what this means is Hobbes had this idea that that there was a state of nature, and that the state of nature is the state without laws, without governance, without a state. And so since people are self-interested and self-motivated, we're egoists and we're hedonists, and we only seek our own pleasure, according to Hobbes. At some point, there's going to necessarily be some tension between you and I, because we're both going to want the same thing. And so, really, in the state of nature is a state of warfare. It's a state of not being able to control the circumstances. And so, what happens, according to Hobbes, is that we each come into agreement that we should we should each give up certain amounts of our freedom to ensure the better good of all. The more freedom for all, in a sense, not necessarily freedom for all, but less warfare, right? So we're not going to fight anymore over goods and resources, because we now have the state to kind of mediate these issues, the sovereign. But Foucault says this idea of power really, it presupposes the subject, and that it fails to recognize how power operates in other ways. How does power operate in the family? How does power operate in the relationship between physicians and patients, between teachers and students, in the workplace? How does it operate in the family and among friends? So media. So really, Foucault is looking at other ways that power operates. And the idea that it presupposes the subject for Foucault is kind of, for him, saying, well, subjects don't freely come into this contractual agreement to allow a sovereign to rule over them. It's gotten to the point from the 17th into the 18th centuries that really the subjects are made by the state, in a sense, for Foucault. That you in a sense are invisible to the state unless you fall within certain categorizations of the state, and you're made an individual through certain power relations and effects of power. And so Foucault, that's kind of his idea. And Foucault also talks about knowledge as a form of power, and that power is productive. Power produces. It doesn't simply repress. And so one of Foucault's theories, one of his analyses of power includes biopower. Foucault believed that during the 17th and really into the 18th centuries is when, in European societies, is when biopower became more prevalent, from his readings of the historical archives. And so for Foucault, biopower refers to new governmental strategies that were developed during the 18th century, which aimed at managing the biological aspects of the population. So it arose with newfound knowledges in biology and statistics, this new idea of humans as a species, and this new way of categorizing the governed in terms of the population, doing statistical analyses of the population. And so biopower operated to really and took interest in birth and death rates, rates of diseases, morbidity rates, really concerned with the functioning of the population and how that population is going to make the state productive. And so Foucault kind of compartmentalizes biopower in two ways. He says that there's disciplinary techniques of biopower and that there's biopolitics. And both of them are aimed at the normalization of society, but they operate on different scales. Discipline, he also refers to as an anatomopolitics, which really is aimed at controlling the human body. And so through punishment, through surveillance, through education, through training, the body becomes disciplined in certain ways. The other branch of this Foucault refers to as biopolitics, and he also calls them technologies of security. And he says that technologies of security operate as intermediaries between men and things. They play an active role in the relations that can be obtained between members of the population and nature. So that through biopower, really the state takes on a role of mediating relations that could be obtained between humans, potentially even in non-humans, humans and work, humans and environment, humans and other humans, right? And so biopolitics also take interest in modifying something in the biological destiny of the species. And so reading Foucault, I think that it can be applied to the study of psychedelics, and this is what I've written about. And so really, I think that the disciplines of psychopharmacology and neuroscience really fortify this biological management of, the population. And so really the emergence of psychopharmacology and neuroscience is really in the, I would say the quarter 20th century to like the mid 20th century, around that time period. And really after that time period is when we see this big illegalization of psychedelics. I mean, it's not necessary for me to prove that point, but it just shows how with new technologies, with new knowledges come new forms of power potentially. And so biopower, you could see it operating in the way that psychedelics have been regulated. And so if we take the war on drugs, for instance, and really the war on drugs, I'm referring to President Nixon's campaign against drugs that was really launched really with the Controlled Substances Act of 1970. There were some cases where LSD was banned earlier, and he officially declared a war on drugs in 1971, but the Controlled Substances Act went into effect in 1971, but really in 1970, this whole Controlled Substances Act and anti-drug rhetoric, right? This is the war on drugs. So really bodies have been disciplined in a way because the education in the household, I was in the DARE program at school. From a very young age, you watch commercials on what drugs would do to your brain that were completely misinformed and not based on science, these anti-drug rhetoric programs. And then you look at the history of the war on drugs, and it's really been used to oppress different minority groups in a lot of ways. And this is something that I've written on, other people have written on extensively. This idea of criminality, social deviancy, and prejudices, right? This even exists today. A lot of times when I say, hey, yeah, I talk about psychedelics, I get a lot of crazy looks or a lot of eye rolls because people might think in academic conferences, because they might think it's something that's not academic, or they might think it's something that doesn't fit in within the paradigm. There's still these prejudices that exist. And many of the people in the audience probably know this because of federal funding for psychedelic research. I still don't know any NSF is still giving any money out, National Science Foundation, but when I last checked, they still had to grant anyone a National Science Foundation grant for psychedelic research. The war on drugs imposed all these mandatory minimum prison sentences. The United States really, it can be said that became the number one leader in incarceration, in a large part due to the war on drugs, and especially the minority groups who are targeted through it. And it makes it illegal to cultivate, sell, or consume these substances, right? Some of these are more, you could call juridical, legal measures, but they have effects on discipline, they have effects on the body. And so through biopolitics, right? How is our biology delimited through biopolitics? Well, our mind-body states, and mind-body states is something that I get from Thomas Roberts, and I have a citation of him in a later slide. And Thomas Roberts says that we have multiple mind-body states, and these different mind-body states can be, sometimes compounded, sometimes with other mind-body states, and certain states might lead to certain enhancements or certain atrophies and certain abilities, whether they're perceptive, whether they're cognitive, whether they're ethical, or even relational in a way. And so our modes of cognition are restricted, right, through the war on drugs. Our perception, our affectual capacities. And affectual capacities refers to our ability to affect and be affected by other things. And this kind of comes from Spinozan kind of philosophy where things can either enhance one's ability to act or things can reduce one's ability to act. And so I think when you think about the relations that are obtained, in a sense that, like the last slide said, that, biopolitics mediates relations between men and things. Really, the war on drugs is mediating our relation to other states of consciousness by mediating our relationship to nature, by mediating our relationship to certain substances. And so our ability to form certain relations, if psychedelics, like I'll show in a later slide, can lead to an enhanced feeling of empathy or relatedness to a non-human, then really my ability to form these relations has been stultified or denied through the legalization of psychedelic substances. Consciousness is also circumscribed, and this is something that I would like to write more about. I alluded to it in some of my writing, but how is normal waking consciousness constructed? And really, this idea of normal waking consciousness is a cultural construction, and the fact that we don't admit psychedelic substances and other substances within our understanding of what normal consciousness is has kind of restricted our abilities in certain ways. And also therapeutic potentials, right? Like all of everyone probably, I'm assuming, in this audience is up to date or has at least heard about all the revolutionary findings in mental health treatment that psychedelics are exhibiting. Why is the population denied this? Well, it's really a biopolitical mechanism in a sense. And so some takeaways, I think, from speaking about Foucault and biopolitics in relation to psychedelics is that I think a genealogy can be done on normal waking consciousness. And genealogy was an approach that Foucault used that he kind of adopted from Nietzsche. And he, it's a way of thinking critically and skeptically about certain phenomena and doing a historical analysis of the reasons for why that particular term came to be the way it was. So I think a genealogy of normal waking consciousness and genealogy of consciousness in period, how did that term come about? How did it differ from previous terms? I think that's needed. I think that more needs to be done on the biopolitics of consciousness, how this is literally has restricted our modes of experiencing the world and understanding the world, maybe even our modes of acquiring knowledge. And then discourses on psychedelics. So how are different discourses on psychedelics shaped, including my own positionality, including those from neuroscience, from psychopharmacology, getting a kind of a zoomed out picture of, wait, what are we contributing to? What is the purpose of this? What larger structures are these potentially feeding into? How am I framing this object? Because everybody's talking about psychedelics as this object, but there's different approaches and different ways of framing it. And there's entheogens, there's psychointegrators, there's psychoplastogens, there's entactogens, there's empathogens. There's a whole host of names that psychedelics are given, and each of these actors attributes different value and different meaning to the substance. But beyond that, the kind of findings that I draw from on psychedelics to kind of legitimize my point is that psychedelics, promote unconstrained modes of cognition that are, higher in levels of excuse me. So they promote, Carhart Harris claims that psychedelics promote unconstrained modes of cognition, right? These disrupt the default mode network, which I might have time to get into in a minute, but they also produce anarchic brain states, he referred to them as, and these are characterized by higher levels of entropy and divergent thinking. So if new ways of thinking, new divergent modes of thought are able to, psychedelics might be able to facilitate them, then this seems to have a direct relationship with power, because if power operates not only through keeping things the way they are, but also keeping concepts fixed in a sense, then the high level priors or beliefs that Carhart Harris and Friston talk about might be able to be manipulated in a sense, which is potentially threatening to a system of power. Increased connectedness to oneself, with others, with the world. This increased connectedness increases in nature relatedness, pro-environmental behaviors, the stronger link between one sense of self and one sense of environment. So I know that each of these studies they're very preliminary, but they're starting to in a sense, corroborate a long-standing claim in the psychedelic community about how psychedelics might influence one's relation to nature. And then there's, the therapeutic aspects of psychedelics, just to name a few, with depression, end-of-life anxiety, and substance abuse. So bringing these findings to anthropological studies, helps us understand things in a new way. So if we're doing an anthropology of depression, maybe I need to include, maybe those topics within medical anthropology need to consider psychedelics, end-of-life anxiety. They're doing ethnography on end-of-life, maybe how to ameliorate certain conditions that are negative in these end-of-life situations, but they're not speaking about psychedelics. And so these are just ways that I find new findings in psychedelics and try to inject them into existing conversations in anthropology. And so, like I was saying earlier, this is kind of one of the big takeaways, I think, that I argue in all of my papers, that, if psychedelics can reduce high-level priors or beliefs, then they can potentially help us change these beliefs to those that are perhaps more oriented towards empathic and altruistic behaviors. And so the way I look at biopolitics, I think is kind of well encapsulated in the quote I have here by Tart, which speaks of that we're certain kind of creatures. Because we are creatures with a certain kind of body and nervous system, a large number of human potentials are in principle available to us. But each of us is born into a particular culture that selects and develops a small number of these potentials, rejects others, and is ignorant of many. We are at once the beneficiaries and the victims of our culture's particular selection. And really, when I think about Christian Ratch and his argument that really psychedelics have been persecuted for a long time. They've been persecuted through Christianization, through inquisitions, through persecution of witches, the Enlightenment, positivism. These have all contributed to really a denial of the value of these alternate states of consciousness. And so really you can almost trace the biopolitics of consciousness beyond the war on drugs, which is something I might get into in the next slide. But let me take a sip of water. All right, so decoloniality. This is another body of work that I've engaged with in my writings, in my university. And so this is a group of scholars that come from Latin America that have come up with decoloniality. And a lot of times they're studying from the perspective of those who felt the effects of colonialism, those who felt the worst effects of colonialism, those who have been forgotten by humanism. And so really the struggles that come from these communities' experiences that have been denied or devalued or invisibilized in a sense. And so one of the main ideas in decoloniality is this idea of coloniality. So colonialism wasn't just Christopher Columbus landing in America or the Inquisitions or the conquests. It came with a hegemonic knowledge system. So coloniality refers to the patterns of domination that emerged during early colonialism, but which continue to define production, culture, intersubjective relations, and labor relations. The coloniality of power is this hegemonic knowledge system that came with it. And this is a system that distributes aesthetic, moral, and epistemic resources in ways that both reproduce and reflect imperial logic. Now, this scholar, Arturo Escobar, who I cite next, I'll be speaking more about him later in the presentation, but he believes that the coloniality of power really has created a modern onto-epistemic order. And this entails this belief of the individual devoid of relational embeddedness. And so this kind of comes from a critique of Cartesian substance metaphysics dualism, that there's mind and matter, and that really mind is the only thing that really exists, and mind orders matter. And this is kind of, in a certain way, prevalent in certain scientific circles where the laws determine the chaotic matter or chaotic nature of the universe. And so it's somewhat still with us, some of these ideas. And it's also the idea from John Locke of breaking the world into primary and secondary qualities, that there's this enduring substance that has motion, mass, and other attributes, but then there's all the qualia or the phenomenal experiences of it. But really, this is what Alfred North Whitehead calls the bifurcation of nature, and we're separating things that aren't really separate in reality. And so Descartes also introduced this idea of this real, objective, and single world, what John Law has referred to as the one world. And so this reinforcement of the single world, Escobar argues, has been brought about through the hierarchization of scientific knowledge and the dismissal of other ways of knowing and being. And so he also says that the integration of capitalist economic models and the market dynamics are also part of this monto-epistemic order. So Quijano, Aníbal Quijano in 1997 wrote a paper in Latin American Journal on the coloniality of power. And he kind of defined it as being linked to capitalism and consolidated in Europe between the 1400s and the 1700s. And it really constitutes itself through the classification and reclassification of the planet. And in this endeavor, the concept of culture becomes crucial. It has an institutional structure component to it that functions through state apparatus, universities, the church. It defines certain spaces to achieve certain ends, and it has an epistemological perspective. And so for decolonial theorist Walter Mignolo, he argues that the Americas were created as a geosocial entity, but that really it wasn't that capitalism came and conquered, what we would refer to as the third world nations, but it was that the Americas were actually what made capitalism possible, because without the conquest, there's no enlightenment. Without the struggles of Latin America and the colonialism, there's no European enlightenment and the advances that came with European and British and American society. And so Boaventura de Sousa Santos is another decolonial scholar who's argued that the coloniality of power constitutes a cognitive empire. It produces an epistemicide of other ways of knowing and being in the world. And through the Enlightenment, it fortifies that there's only one mode of representation, that progress and rationality are, the ways to solve all of our problems, this idea of humanism, the scientific method. And so this isn't necessarily just a demonization of science. It's a demonization of science in the sense that when science is used as a hegemonic knowledge system to deny other ways of knowing. So I should say that when I talk about science and when I talk about these modes of thought, because we could still be scientific and rational, as I might have time to talk about this later, but if our research and our endeavors are oriented towards struggles, but not oriented towards reinforcing kind of the status quo or business as usual models of reality that have led us into certain predicaments like colonialism, like the atrocities of development, like our ecological crisis. And so these decolonial scholars believe that a lot of these things are the result of, the Cartesian substance metaphysics, universality, and essentialism. So this idea that, one thing has these attributes, then all things like it have those attributes. This idea of universalizing and essentializing, which doesn't take real context or immanence into account, and the idea of linear time. And so sometimes they refer to the cognitive empire as the epistemologies of the North, and it doesn't necessarily refer to a geographic location. It's just meant to refer to as Eurocentric hegemonic knowledge systems that entail colonialism, patriarchy, and capitalism. So what does decolonial posit? Well, decolonial posits a political and epistemic delinking from colonial epistemology. So it's not trying to produce knowledge outside of the system of coloniality, the coloniality of power. So to decolonize according to decolonial theorists, it entails decolonizing both the knowledge of the colonized and the colonizer. It also entails a mixture of knowledges, what they also refer to as the ecology of knowledges. And so this is a recognition that there's a co-presence of different ways of knowing. And so it calls for collaboration and the celebration of difference, that there's diverse ways of understanding the world, diverse ways of being, the diverse ways of living, that all should coexist in a sense. And this sense is, they get this quote from a guerrilla movement, the Zapatistas from Mexico, that to create a world in which many worlds fit. And so this is this idea that there's many worlds within this one world, within the world. And but we want to create a world which is not dominated by one worldview in a sense. And so this kind of is situated within the ontological term within anthropology somewhat, that people really live in different worlds, that their world making processes, their ontological commitments, what exists, how it exists, what its relations are to the other things that exist, that they literally, it's so different from ours that they literally live in another world, in a sense. That's kind of the ontological term, what it posits. And so a lot of decolonial theorists situate the knowledge claims from the struggles coming from Latin American communities as the source of epistemologies of the South, or the anti-imperial South. So these are knowledges born in struggles against capitalism, colonialism, and patriarchy. And they're an attempt to allow the oppressed to represent the world in their own terms, to speak from what they call their own locus of enunciation. And so the epistemologies of the North kind of posit that this is the only valid source of acquiring knowledge, or the only valid source of knowledge, and that the Western understanding of the world is exactly that. But the epistemologies of the South are attempting to erase these higher power hierarchies, affirm and valorize difference, and overcome normative dualisms. And so when I think about psychedelics and what I've written about how the psychedelics, or how does decoloniality inform psychedelics, is really, how does psychedelics continue a perpetual colonial how do psychedelics lend themselves to enduring colonial projects? And so I think about psychedelic capitalism, right? And this is something I would like to look more into and write more about, which is issues of biopiracy. So, taking indigenous potential that belong to indigenous groups, certain substances that might belong to them, intellectual property, how the usage of these substances, the knowledge that we gain from other groups' use of these substances, what's happening in this process as psychedelics become capitalized, and there's all this fight and scramble for patents. There's a suppression of the use of psychedelics by others. So not everyone has access to psychedelic medicine. Not everyone will have access to psychedelic medicine. And then the allopathic model of medicine. So Matthew Johnson, I wrote an opinion piece not too long ago, in which I think he fairly argues that we need to respect the boundaries of that have been established through clinical psychology when we deal with psychedelics. We can't fall into psychedelic exceptionalism. But at the same time, I think that when thinking from a decolonial perspective, there are absolutely other ways of using psychedelics that don't fall within the allopathic model, that you don't only use psychedelics when you're trying to treat a symptom, where you're trying to treat the cause of a particular disease. You might integrate them into everyday life, and it falls within the different understandings of medicine. Other allopathic model of medicine has also achieved a type of hegemony on different modes of healing. And so I think about the noetic quality of psychedelic experiences. So William James wrote about the noetic quality. Roland Griffiths continues to write about the noetic quality of psychedelic experience, and certain other, but these don't fall within the regular empirical ways of acquiring knowledge, systematic ways of acquiring knowledge. So although we might value the subjective experience reports to a certain extent if they contribute to certain therapeutic values, we're not necessarily regarding the experiences that people have as valid, as veridical in a sense. And this has potential implications, I think, for how do we consider the validity of psychedelic knowledge or states of knowledge that come about. The locus of enunciation, indigenous perspectives, the co-creation of knowledge. If we are studying with psychedelic communities, are we co-creating this knowledge? Are they co-authored? Are they vouching for everything that we do? Is this a participatory type of practice? Integrating psychedelics as other ways of knowing, like I kind of spoke about before. And then war on drugs. So before I analyze the war on drugs as a biopolitical enterprise, as a state enterprise that is interested in modifying the biological destiny, and psychedelics become wrapped up in that. But from decolonial perspective, really we can look at the war on drugs as just the latest stage of a neocolonial enterprise that has delimited states of consciousness for centuries, if not millennia. And so the last point I want to make is kind of has to do with some of my preliminary research. So I really started my research looking at human environment relations, but what I'm finding a lot more is that what seems to be predominant in people's experience reports and the interviews is that people learn about themselves. I learned this about myself, or this self-talk, or these takeaways, these lessons. And Foucault, who I mentioned earlier, later in his life kind of wrote about how power might operate from the bottom up as well, and how you can re-subjectivize your subjectivity in a sense, take it into your own hands. And this is some people have written about drug-assisted technologies of the self and some other areas, but I really would like to expand more on this idea of psychedelics as technologies of the self. And so my last section, if you're still here, thank you for being with me, is on design. And so design is a concept that's easy and hard to understand at the same time. So it kind of refers to everything, but it also refers to something very specific. So when you read design theorists, who I haven't engaged with so many of them, but I've engaged with some of the more contemporary ones, they talk about design. Design applies to everything. Design, animals design their environments, humans design their environments. But in a more specific sense, design theorists have said that design is actually a way of looking at things that entails reflection and a strategic sense. And it requires us to look at a context and decide whether and how to improve the state of affairs. So you're perceiving this particular situation, and then you're designing a way to approach that situation that might change that situation and also change you in the process. And so Herbert Simon was one of the earliest people to coin the term design or speak about design. And he said that it's concerned with how things ought to be, how they ought to be in order to attain goals and to function. So making things how they ought to be, and design helps to make things how they ought to be, is kind of how they describe it. And so Anne Marie Willis is another designer who talks about designs. When we design our world acts back and designs us. And so this is this idea that everybody is really a designer, and some of the more critical, radical design theorists are kind of trying to get design out of expert hands, industrial designers, into more everyday, that we all design, really. We all design everything that we do, from our clothes to the way that we express ourselves, to the way that we arrange our house, to the type of social relations we have, that everything that can be seen as a potential design, or from a design perspective. And so Ezio Manzini is one of the more recent ones, a recent theorist who speaks about design, and he has this idea of social innovation, that a group of citizens can collaborate in an original way to solve a problem and open new opportunities. So he's about empowering communities to take design measures into their own hands. So if there's a food desert, how can this community maybe perhaps design ways to do guerrilla farming, or so on and so forth. But who I've engaged with mostly is Arturo Escobar, who a lot of his research and a lot of his insights are informed by the struggles of Latin American, indigenous, and other social movements. And he has this idea that we should need to put cultural and political autonomy firmly within the scope of design, and that we need to reorient design from its functionalist, rationalistic, and industrial traditions from which it emerged towards a type of rationality and a set of practices attuned to the relational dimension of life. And so you can see on the screen, he kind of envisions going from a functional to a relational, from an object-centered to a human-centered, from an expert-led to a community-led, and from duality to plurality. And so he kind of envisions taking design from its modernist understandings and invigorating design with this relational potential to change life worlds, in a sense. And so he also says that design is ontological, and that all design objects, tools, and even services bring about particular ways of knowing and doing. And I would add to that design is ontological in the sense that even what we are attempting to design is ontological from the first, because how we conceive of what exists and its relations and the value judgments we attribute to that is part of the design process. So design is also very intimately linked with language. It's something that I argue in one of my papers. And so Escobar argues that there's a coloniality of design. And so that really the standardization of the one world that exists separate from us, and this reinforcement of the idea of the individual that is isolated from its interrelational embeddedness, comes from this colonial imposition on design and the colonial modernist origins out of which design practice has emanated, in a sense, or emerged. It disempowers and prevents us from partnering with nature. And Escobar, again, attributes modern patriarchal capitalism, including both its territorial and its ontological occupations, as having defuturing effects. So this commodification of nature, this endless commodification of everything, is really, we've seen what it's leading to in terms of environmental destruction, in terms of species extinction, in terms of social injustices worldwide. And so this has been a perpetual business as usual mode of operating in all fields, really, this modernist mentality. And in the concept of design, Escobar finds it operating as well. And so he introduces this idea of political ontology that he gets from, I believe it's Mario de Blaser and Marisol de la Cadena. And he talks about political ontology, that different ways of knowing and being are needed to combat this crisis in worldview, because the coloniality of design really stems from a crisis in worldview. And so new modes of thought are needed, rooted in relational worlds or ontologies. And so Escobar exposes the ontological, he believes that political ontology exposes the ontological occupation of relational worlds by a dominant world. And he calls for a collective weaving of a world in which many worlds fit, or life-centered design into existence. And so what I've kind of seen, all of my interventions are very theoretical at this stage. I don't have so much of my field work to substantiate my claims, but I have other scientific research that hasn't been brought into conversation with these themes that can speak to them, I believe. And Escobar speaks about collaboration and about openness. So you need to be open to changing systems. You need to be open to new modes of being, new modes of relating, new types of knowledges. And really, we see that psilocybin increases one of the big 5 personality traits, which is openness, right? In terms of well-being. And so that's a fundamental aspect of life, that people's well-being should be included in their life plan, or it should be within the scope of possibility within our design systems. And really, personal well-being, the amount of people who are depressed, the amount of people who are suffering from anxiety, these type of things are not insured by our current system. And so really, psychedelics and well-being contribute to how are we designing our world, and how are we designing our therapeutic practices, how are we designing our diets, in a sense. Altruistic behaviors and empathy, right? If in a sense, these are very preliminary studies, but if people tend to have more altruistic tendencies, people tend to be more empathic, in a sense, then this is exactly the type of way that design needs to be reoriented away from individualistic, isolated sense of self to a more communal sense of self, one sense of self in community with both human and non-human. And this study with Pokorny that I mentioned on empathy, it's interesting because they say that psychedelics, at least in that study, can't prove that psychedelics, they do not actually improve moral decision making, but they do enhance emotional empathy. But for me, I think that that's a little bit backwards, because I would think that it's more important to feel than to cognitively relate. I think it's more important to be able to feel the suffering of an animal, feel the suffering of another human, feel the suffering to be able to have the capacity for that feeling, to me, is more important than having the cognitive ability to, but that's a conversation for another day. Spirituality, how has our spirituality been, do we have a spiritual dimension included within our modern design practices? No, we don't, right? And this idea of relational ways of being. Charles Laughlin has an article in I think it's Time and Mind, about how alterations in consciousness, including those brought about by entheogens, lead to different perceptions of the landscape and the commons, and how certain states of consciousness might lead to an individualistic and fragmented sense of self in relation to environment, and a more, property management, demarcating, calculative type of way of understanding the environment, versus when altered states of consciousness, and including those induced by entheogens, tend to lead to more sacred understandings of the landscape, of more of one's interrelatedness, one's embeddedness within that landscape. And so he has an argument about that. And others have argued that there's a relationship between psychedelic use and conversion to Buddhism. And so Buddhism, as many of you might know, it's constituted on relational modes of being and a type of relational ethics. There's a stronger sense of, links between self and environment, and really what I take away the most is this idea of rebooting and inactivating dysfunctional behaviors. And so I don't have much time, but I'm going to try to fly through this. So in the article that I based some of this talk on, I kind of speak about how we've denatured nature. And so I get this idea from this book by this philosopher, and I'm not sure how to pronounce his name, Kratovchvil. And he talks about the origins of nature in Greek language and how physis came about, and that's how it's supposed to be pronounced, and that nature has this spontaneity, this vegetative, this generative aspect to it that can never be captured by our reifications. And so he talks about how, since it can never be captured, our reifications are always partial, and they're always delimit natures to a certain extent, whether they're pragmatic or utilitarian reasons. And so the fact that, and he says that, we have dissected the earth, which we have drowned so carefully that nobody notices it. And he really says that, by sequestering the natural and nature from themselves, including from their spontaneity and their inner lives, we gain a degree of mastery over them at the cost of limiting their capacities to what we demand of them. And this, I think, is helpful because this isn't like against, we can't reify, we can't stratify, we can't delimit things. It's not about that. It's understanding that that's exactly what it is. It's a delimitation, that we need to understand that all of our categories and our subjects are partial, and that a lot of times they've led to colonial and oppressive situations based on these fixed ideas that we attach to certain substances, to certain concepts that then regulate our perception and behavior. And I guess the last thing I would like to say is really that if we can accept this idea that psychedelics can loosen or reified categories, that they bring about what John Baker calls desemanticized states, or David Nichols talks about rebooting and inactivating dysfunctional behaviors, and Carhart Harris talks about how our beliefs become more malleable, and other thinkers corroborate this idea. Well, then perhaps the colonial legacies, the oppressive ideologies that are really rooted in our languages, might be able to be destabilized through psychedelic states of consciousness. And this doesn't necessarily mean a massive heroic dose, right? This even brings up the idea of microdosing and small incremental changes that might potentially change ways of relating, ways of perceiving, ways of understanding nature and each other. Thank you. I think I'm like 2 minutes over, but thanks.
Thank you so much for that. That was extremely interesting. I could continue listening for another hour, but I will not put other people through that. But thank you. So we have a lot of questions for you.
Okay, cool.
So I will start with the most upvoted right now. What impact do you think the growing understanding of psychedelics can have on vulnerable indigenous populations? How do you think the relationship of power in a capitalist model can affect them?
That's a really good question. I'm writing it down so I don't forget. So what can psychedelics do for vulnerable indigenous populations? And it's, depends on, we have to situate each, indigenous population within its own context, because the dynamics of colonialism affect each group differently, and there's different ways and different, there's mining, there's logging, there's, religion, there's different colonial mechanisms in a sense that affect different groups in different ways. Development, there's certain indigenous communities that are located in urban environments. So how have they been affected versus other ones who actually might have territory? So I think that it's super difficult to try to say how psychedelics might help a vulnerable indigenous population. One thing I can think of is I have a colleague in my university who works with an urban indigenous community, and they didn't historically or traditionally use ayahuasca, but from coming into contact with the Envera community in Colombia, this Muisca community, which is located in Bogota, Colombia, has adapted that practice. And in that sense, that community, since they live in an urban environment, and the history of Colombia has basically erased colonial indigenous heritages up until about 1991, all indigenous people were categorized under an economic classification. So they're all farmers in a sense, more or less, campesinos. And so this is a colonial history that erased all the history of the traditional knowledge, in a sense, much of it that these communities had. But this community is in a process of ethnogenesis, is what they refer to it as, and a revitalization of culture. And so they're going to archives and they're trying to recreate their languages, recreate their practices. And part of this, they're collaborating with other indigenous communities. So their use of ayahuasca, they've said from their perspective that helps them to forge the bonds of their community better, to help relate to bring the community together, to help the community create new ways of symbolically appropriating their territory. So, lands that have been encroached upon by expansion of urbanization, the meanings that are attributed to that land have in a sense been lost, but they're still the same land and they still have the same history, and they're still the descendants of indigenous people who've been colonized. So they want to reattribute the sense of sacredness that they have with this land. And so yeah, I think it's an amazing question, but it's hard for me to be able to, like I said in this whole presentation, to speak from the perspective of the indigenous, speak for the indigenous community is to me impossible. But what I can talk about is, the psychedelic capitalism. I mean, there's people from MAPS, Natalie Ginsburg and Ishmael, I forgot his last name. They came out with an article recently about, should Maria Sabina and her family be compensated for the intellectual property of bringing psilocybin into the Western consciousness? And that's a super fascinating question.
Could you just do a quick recap of the Maria Sabina story for those who may not know?
Yeah, from what I know about Maria Sabina's story is really Gordon Wasson was this rich banker who got really into studying mushrooms, and then he heard about from certain people these mushroom veladas that were happening in Sierra Mazatec of Mexico, and this woman that would administer this, not administer, that's like a west, but would facilitate the ceremony in a way, right? Mm-hmm. And so he went over there and he had this amazing ecstatic experience, and he wrote about it in Life magazine, and it really brought this massive attention to psilocybin mushrooms. And really that project is what brought psilocybin into the laboratory, because he gave, I think, to Albert Hoffman or Roger Heim, and then Roger Heim gave them to Hoffman. And so this is how the isolation of psilocybin and all this came about. But and the term psilocybin and psilocin and all that, how they isolated the compounds, how they were able to regrow the mushrooms, all that. But the effects that had on Maria Sabina are said to be really detrimental to her, and that her community ousted her, and that there was a lot of tourism after that was going to the community. So many people say that actually her life was ruined by this visit from Gordon Wasson. Although in the beginning he came and gave her synthesized psilocybin, and she was like, "Oh, great! Now I can have ceremonies when there's no mushrooms." Apparently, the word is that it had a lot of neo-colonial effects on her, and was not for the best of the community. So long story short, I think that it's hard for me to say a positive effect that capitalism is having for indigenous communities. I'm sorry to say that. I mean, I really don't see positives, but maybe I'm just too critical. I don't.
Yeah. Well, so do you think that, just following up on this question, do you think that initiatives to make more fair modes of distribution of psychedelics in the current structure, people that are trying to kind of reform capitalism so that we can include some of the original beneficiaries of psychedelics, or the original producers of psychedelics, do you think that has that kind of reformation possibility, has a chance at, I guess, having a less detrimental effect on typically subjugated groups?
Yeah, I mean, I think that maybe sorry, did you have something else?
Oh, I would just said, do you think that there's any hope there with these kind of half measures, or do you think no?
I mean, the hope is in the sense that, if peyote is really running out, like a lot of articles are saying, it's really just for the Native American communities. It's very endangered. The people who are licensed to grow peyote or peyote, I say peyote a lot. The people who are licensed for peyote are losing their licenses, and they're not being renewed. So there's leading to all these, problems with that. So maybe like that talk that you're talking about, that's going to happen in a few weeks, right? Making a synthetic form of mescaline, could that possibly allow an indigenous group to have access to something that might have been exploited by Westerners? Mm-hmm. Maybe, yeah. That's I'm not a pessimist about the future at all. I think that there's I always orient my theories towards the possible, towards the new, towards relational ways of being. And I think psychedelics are part of that. But it's hard for me to speak about, like what positive, like all we've done, the history of academia is take from indigenous knowledges, take from indigenous peoples. So it's very hard to say, oh yeah, we're going to bring back to this community. And a lot of times neo-colonial mechanisms are shaped exactly in that form. We're going to help development. We're going to help you protect biodiversity. We're going to help you protect, and there's all sorts of articles and human geographers and anthropology say, actually, that's led to worse effects. Actually, that was even more detrimental for certain communities. Actually, that you just sold that patch of rainforest that was to like a meat slaughtering company or whatever. And so like, which was supposed to be protected. So, or the Nature Conservancy was like selling, I remember reading one time was selling certain properties. And so things that you think that are originally euphemistically phrased might, and even, like Alan Watts says, like, the road to hell is paved with good intentions. Mm-hmm. And so you might have all these great things. Oh, I'm going to help that other person. I'm going to help. But in a way, you might end up colonizing them worse. But I'm not pessimistic, right? Like, I think that there is. I guess I have to think more about that. And I think that thank you for bringing that up. And that's something that I should think more about. How can we positively? And I think this idea that connecting psychedelics to design, connecting psychedelics to decoloniality is really the way. Can we help destabilize these inherited patterns of thought, these inherited ways of doing things that don't include community, that aren't co-collaborative, that don't include other ways of knowing? If, like the decoloniality theorists say, it's also decolonizing the colonizer's knowledge. So in that process, can we create a more pluriversal world? Can we include more other perspectives? Can we actually do that, right? Because it's actually really difficult to sit down with somebody from a different worldview and be able to try to communicate and collaborate, whether you're talking about property or territory or health or healing. Like there's certain irreconcilable differences in concepts and understanding. So, but yeah, I think that for us, if we can use psychedelics to make us, less individualistic, less isolated from one another, less, numbed to what's happening to nature, then I think that in the process, other groups who have been marginalized would also be included within that,
Yeah, I thought it was really interesting, the connection you brought into the view of pristine nature informing the whole like national parks project. And I had never thought about that before. Like, that's weird that there's like nature, but humans are not a part of it. That's just like that's a completely separate thing. And if humans are in it, then it's corrupted by us. But actually, no, humans are part of nature. They should live in nature. They shouldn't necessarily run over trees to build streets and extract oil from it. But, why should we take people out of nature and see that as natural?
There was an article in The Guardian, I think, that was about how the Amazon was like a food forest. And they're like, look, a lot of these trees are the way they are from human impact. But it's the fact that it's certain types of human relations to nature here that allowed the Amazon to become this amazing, rich, biodiverse place. Versus, it's not that it was completely without humans. It's that the humans that lived there had a certain way of living with the land that was allowed co-flourishing in a sense, right? And so, I mean, I don't know. I haven't checked back into that article in a while, but that's out there.
Yeah, it's so cool. Something that your work really draws out to me is how much dualism and the subject-object duality, but also the mind-body duality has so permeated so much of just Western behavior, like let alone thinking. Just like, humans and are opposed to nature, I just think that's so interesting. I hadn't thought about it that way at all. So, okay, the next question is by my friend Yasmin at Johns Hopkins. There is a movement. Oh, sorry, just moved. There is a movement in neuroscience and psychiatry to create non-hallucinogenic psychedelic drugs, basically removing the psychedelic experience from psychedelics. Do you think there is value to this approach? How do you think this would affect our relationship to drugs/psychedelics as a society?
Yeah, I think there's absolutely value in that approach. I think that there's people who basically, I don't know if they'll ever be ready to have a hallucinogenic experience. I mean, everybody's One thing I study a lot in anthropology and is I study a lot of philosophy that's process oriented, and it's this relational process ontology. It doesn't looks at things in terms of events. Like I'm not just this being that has these attributes. Like I'm happening. Like I'm in every moment. I'm in process. I'm in flux, and so I think that there's some people that they might not be able to handle the psychedelic experience based on the particular, what I would call their assemblage, right? They have a particular arrangement of things that's happened to them, their life history, their personality, their physiology, all of these things that might not help them they might not ever be ready to have a hallucinogenic experience, whereas other people might be more predisposed based on their life experience, based on their history, based on their physiology, based on their attitude towards that type of experience. That's also included in it, because when I do my ethnographic research, there are a lot of people that have horrible experiences, right? Like I read about these, and sometimes they don't, and most of them don't end up terribly, but they definitely could go really bad. And so this is part of because people aren't ready for that type of experience in a way. I think so. I think that. I missed the talk that David Olson gave on psychoplastogens, but if in some way they're creating neurogenesis without there being a hallucinogenic effect, if in some way microdosing, like Paul Stamets says that potentially microdosing psilocybin with lion's mane might be able to create new neural networks. Maybe that type of way can allow us to have, more, because from what I've read in the literature, and obviously I'm not a psychopharmacologist, I'm not a neuroscientist, I'm not a psychiatrist, but from what I've read is that some of these things that we associate with not like I guess like dysfunctional social behaviors are attributed to like low serotonin levels. And so if there's so this is like a biological mechanistic understanding of like behavior, right? And really people with lower serotonin uptake, and maybe I'm getting it wrong, you can correct me if I'm wrong, they have and people that have better serotonin uptake have more pro-social behaviors, right? So in that sense, if that's true, arguing like along those lines from like a strictly kind of mechanistic drug interactionism kind of approach, then yeah, maybe people can benefit from the non-hallucinogenic aspects of psychedelics because it's contributing to neurogenesis. It's allowing them to make connections in their mind that they maybe weren't making before, associations with their environment. But I think that and I think that there's a article on Psychedelic Science Review that talks exactly about this. Like, are the subjective experiences necessary? And they kind of compartmentalize, they kind of pitch Roland Griffiths against David Olson, and they kind of depict David Olson saying, look, you don't really need the hallucinogenic effect, and Griffiths being like, you absolutely need it. And I would tend to side more with the fact that I think that there could be changes with the non-hallucinogenic substances, but I think that the experiences that people report are so profound, and the people are so moved by these experiences, and they're so convinced by the validity or the truth that this experience gave them. Like they ranked them. Like I met my wife, I had a kid, and like psychedelics, like that's or psychedelics, I met my wife, had a kid. Like that's how people talk a lot of times,
Mm-hmm.
So I think that, I don't know, I think the more transformative, transpersonal type of experiences that happen are the phenomenology is really important, I think. But I don't know enough about this, and I don't think anybody knows enough about this to say for a fact that we don't really need the hallucinogenic experience. But that's my take on it, that I think that the more transformative aspects are probably the experience is important, but those people who, there could be something to this idea that we can maybe enhance empathy without a hallucinogenic effect or something like that,
Yeah, well, something I definitely think about with relation to this question is, do the subjective effects of psychedelics also like provide some of the content, like some of the plastic effects might then might have to do with, I guess, like if why are you thinking so much about nature when you're under the influence of psychedelics? Well, if you take away the subjective effects, would you be thinking about nature? Like That because how responsible for the content of your thoughts is the hallucinogenic aspect. Maybe it isn't, maybe it is, but that's something that we really do have to discover down the road. But I definitely, that's a huge question for me as well.
Yeah, absolutely. And I don't know. And something like like everything I say, I'm also my own worst enemy. Like I'm super critical of a lot of things I say too. So I'm like, oh, psychedelics can do this. And then I'm like, no, they can't. Because like people, I see so many cases that I'm like, that doesn't fall within this romantic notion that I've been writing about or whatever. So yeah, it's case by case scenario, I guess. But yeah, like you say, like there tend to be common features regardless of how diverse and unique these experiences are. And why is that? Why is the experience so, it's not completely haphazard, right? For people, it's scripted in a sense. It's a journey in a sense a lot of times. So, but why would it be that way? Like if this substance is just, causing, neural haywire or whatever, or happens to produce neurogenesis, why should that experience be so meaningful? Why should the content unfold in the way it does? Why should it have this autobiographical nature? Is it just because it's activating these regions of the brain in a random way, of the hypothalamus? And like, I don't know. To me, there's much more intelligence seems to be there than just considering it like an agonist of a certain receptor. I don't.
Well, definitely, like on the face of it, using a term, now this is very not, rigorous, but on the face of it, using a term like the anarchic brain to describe a state in which actually there's so much organization, and yes, there's divergent thinking, and there's a lot of like, the inability to separate foreground from background. Like things are more likely to draw your attention or to distract you. Sure, but also there is an absolute structure to the experience that that does seem to just go against the idea, entropy. But
And there's an interesting tie there between, a lot of people who write about anarchism and like the abolishing of these oppressive paternalistic structures, these top-down structures. A lot of we hear anarchy and we think of like Capitol Hill, or then we think about the George Floyd protests. Yeah. Like this is where our mind goes. This is what our politicians say anarchy is. But anarchy is about, not letting authority structures take over, our agency in a sense, and that has led to certain types of social relations and social environmental relations that are destructive. And so a lot of anarchist thinkers, they promulgate, the expanding our ethics to include human and non-human others. They're like, no, we don't want hierarchies. It's kind of what anarchists say. And so that there's a connection there between anarchic brain states and anarchy as a social scientific theory that I think are interesting to explore.
I totally was wondering if that was going to come up, because I was just this use of this word choice, the anarchic, like to use a blatantly political word, right? When already like we use words to mitigate the concept of hierarchy in neuroscience. Like we say the brain is a heterarchy because there's so much like recursion, right? But now like bringing in the idea of anarchy, it also like almost seems to intentionally harken back to the relationship of psychedelics with the protest movements in the 20th century.
Yeah, that's cool. And like anarchy is about abolishing top down and kind of like allowing bottom up to flourish. And like the way Carhart Harris describes is literally DMN is a top down position on this otherwise, more expansive, more interconnected state of consciousness, and it restricts bottom up flows of information. So you're really like, wow, like this matches up hip and thigh with a lot of this theory of anarchist theory.
Definitely.
Yeah, that's something I like the idea of.
Yeah, I agree. So I guess let's do two more of these questions. Okay, what in particular do you think the state gains from circumscribing or constructing normal waking consciousness as opposed to other modes of consciousness? Or conversely, what is the state so afraid of?
Yeah, that's a really good question. And it's something I guess I need to write more in depth or more about. But if I'm working within, an understanding of that capitalist social relations and economic classes, and this idea of, the individual subject, these lend themselves to capitalist modes of production and the idea. And so social movements, which are many times associated with, socialism or communism, sometimes they call them communists, these have historically been targeted by not only the war on drugs in international context, but like just government, state in general has tried to eradicate a lot of socialist uprising, socialist movements around Latin America, around what they would call the global South. And so I think that reinforcing, I mean, it's a really good question, because like, what does the state have to gain, right? But I mean, if business as usual, if the way things operate now can be attributed to this legacy of colonialism, this idea of substance metaphysics from Descartes, this idea of the individual as an isolated individual unit that's separate from its interrelations, and that these ideologies can help fortify, the structure of capitalism. How can, what does the state have to gain if we categorize nature as a commodity? It has a lot to gain. It has a lot of economic value to gain. What if the state categorizes nature as a sacred entity? What's going to happen to capitalism? I mean, I think that a lot of these things match up. A lot of them can be traced back to economic analyses, right? Like, how is the state going to gain? But also in terms of, I don't know, if competition is what drives the market and collaboration is not, then those modes of consciousness that are more in line with competition. So like, I think of Arthur, I almost put the slide in my presentation and I didn't. So Arthur Dykman in 1971, he talked about bimodal consciousness, and he talked about how there was two modes of consciousness. And obviously this is super simplistic, this is before neuroscience, but Carhart-Harris stuff kind of matches up with it in a way. And how normal consciousness is more associated with making boundaries, right? This harkens back to Terence McKenna too, as psychedelics as boundary dissolving tools. Mm-hmm. And so this sharp delineation between self and other is really needed for survival purposes, but it also helps states in terms of thinking individuals not wanting to collaborate in a way, or not thinking of themselves as connected with other individuals or connected with their immediate life world, or how does that tree affect my oxygen, or how do I affect that tree, and things like that. And so I think that he talks about there's the action mode, and then there's receptive mode. And in receptive mode, boundaries are dissolved and there's a more intake of one's environment. And so to try to connect that back to that idea really is that, if certain social relations and certain social environmental structures are, in a sense, fortified by the metaphysics that we have inherited, by the economic systems that we've inherited, if those are destabilized by anything, then they are seen as potential threats to the state. And we saw this, when psychedelics were first illegalized. I mean, in a sense, people being more empathic and more altruistic doesn't necessarily serve the state. But in a broader sense than that, I think that the government, there was a lot of CIA governmental experimentation on psychedelics in the 60s and even in the 50s. And so psychedelics were immediately banned after these projects kind of went away. And so it makes you question, if there is a therapeutic value to psychedelics, if there is all these pro-social effects, why are they illegal then? What justifies their illegalization? And so that's kind of the question I would ask back to that. Mm-hmm. So, okay, what does the state have to gain? And I agree, like, I even think about that myself, like, damn, like, can I even make that statement? Like, what does the state really have to gain? But then when this is where my mind goes. And then I think, well, why the else do they make them illegal then, right? And so, yeah, they're coming back through these economic models that the state definitely has interest in nowadays. So maybe they weren't illegal because they had all these pro-social effects and that they had all these, decolonizing effects. That really wasn't it. They just weren't properly channeled through the right economic, outlets until it was ready. And now that it's happening with what happened with cannabis, right?
Yeah.
And so I don't know. I mean, I think that's a good question, and I think it's a critical question that I needed to hear, and that I have to, try to I guess, give a better answer. I don't feel
Well,
happy with my answer.
well, actually, something interesting that I think that you just reminded me of that you talked about earlier is kind of this fallacy in Hobbes's account of how the state comes together, which is that we're saving each other from a state of war. Well, actually, what usually happens is some mean, scary guy comes and makes you do things for him.
Yeah.
But actually, again, if the state really was this place where people are coming for safety and to get out of a state of war with one another and into a state of cooperation, you would think substances that promote empathy and altruism actually, enhance that project, right?
Yeah.
And that would create more social cohesion, if that is in fact what the state is for. And then on the other hand, I think about the opium wars, right? The state is happy to use drugs, any drugs at all, that will subjugate some group of people that it works for them to do, or that drives more capitalist consumption, like alcohol, right? So yeah, that was very interesting to me. I also loved that. I never thought about that either when I read Hobbes. So that was also really interesting.
Well, I mean, like also like that idea of if you don't really, people don't buy Foucault's account of power. Not everyone buys that, right? And so that's totally fine. If you don't believe that the state has interest in managing the biological aspects of the population, which you can see in like the vaccine measures, which you can see in a lot of public health measures that the state from top down, and I don't know if they're necessarily always done with the best interest of the population, and so there's a lot of these top-down measures. I mean, you can have total faith in the state and total skepticism that the state is insidious in any way, but I don't know. I think that the history of everything kind of goes against how, but I do want to say that like within the cognitive liberty decriminalization movements, these type of things, they're operating within a sovereign understanding of power and within laws, but we can also see how problematic that's becoming, because like, okay, it's decriminalized, but then it's not people's people's legal kind of entanglements with the law are not erased, right? Like your history of having been caught with this substance, or in certain states, okay, it might be decriminalized, but what about the people that are actually in prison right now, or might be even serving a life sentence for like getting caught with marijuana 3 times or something like that? So I don't know. I mean, these are just places my mind go.
Well, I think the evidence that the state has an interest in controlling our biology is everywhere, because by putting people in jail, you control who's free to reproduce, and also by making certain people completely dependent on a wage for a living, controls what kinds of things can be produced and how many people will be put to work producing those things. I absolutely personally buy that, but of course that is and my friend Yasmin said in the chat, literally abortion issues. That well, I think it's absolutely everywhere. Okay, so then one more question. Thank you so much, by the way, for all of your time. This is
no, of course, I'm happy to be here.
Yeah. All right. So, in the spirit of interconnectedness that psychedelics promote, how do you propose scientists of different subjects tackle the stigma surrounding psychedelics and its research? What could be an effective way of bridging the clinical, preclinical, and social sciences in a way to educate each other and the public?
Okay, so preclinical. All right, so I have to think about this for a minute. So the first part of that question has to do with what again?
In the spirit of interconnectedness that psychedelics promote, how do you propose that scientists tackle the stigma surrounding psychedelics?
Yeah, so the stigma. So there was an article recently, I don't know if David will find it or not, but there was an article that talked about coming clean with your psychedelic use, right? And there was a researcher who wrote an article about this and how he was perceived by his colleagues when he by coming out about his psychedelic use, and how he was kind of ridiculed in a sense, right? Like and or looked down upon in a sense, like, oh, you're not following proper protocols or this or that, and so or that you're a drug user, or these ideologies that spawn. So I think that one way to combat the the stigmatization of drugs is by being open about drugs, right? Talking about drugs. I think that when I'm in like the worst states of mind where I think that my research isn't doing anything, the only thing I think of is like, at least I'm writing about drugs, and like, at least I'm talking about drugs. And this is something that I always, when I give guest lectures to student classes, that I always start with, what's a drug? What is a drug? And so really like educating people about drugs in general, I think is huge. And like, I've seen Carl Hart's new book, and he's been everywhere with his new book defending, drug use. And he's gotten a lot of pushback. But I think at the end of the day, I think it's important to do what he's doing. It's extremely brave and super brave to be able to do that. To say, yeah, I use heroin or whatever substance one uses, right? That's still illegal.
Yeah.
So I think talking about it, educating is really one of the most important ways. Like my own, like I said in the beginning of my talk, like my own experience is always like, I'm, the class, we'll go around introducing ourselves. Oh, my topic's immigration. Oh, my topic's, diaspora. Oh, my topic's psychedelics. Everybody's like, what the hell? They'll just stay quiet, or they will completely ignore that, ignore it. It'll make them so uncomfortable. And like, I've had to grow like thick skin and get used to it. And I've had to work a little bit harder, I think, to try to be as rigorous as I can, incorporating theory or making arguments. But I still deal with the stigma all the time. I think the stigma is going to be here for a while until I guess the pharmaceutical companies get the green light to mass produce things, and NSF starts funding psychedelic research in that way. I think
only when we can make billions of dollars off of them.
Yeah, unfortunately, like, that seems to be the trajectory, right? Like, unfortunately, but as far as collaborating with, like, I think naturally all the disciplines are becoming more interdisciplinary in a sense. I'm not in the natural sciences, so I don't know what it's like in there, but but in a sense, I think that even the fact that I'm able to speak here to people from other disciplines is a fact that things are changing, and that interdisciplinarity is becoming more respectable. It's becoming more sought after by universities. How can you pull from all these different subjects and bring them all together? And how can you bring a ethnobotanist into conversation with a psychopharmacologist, with an anthropologist, with a historian? And like, and I think psychedelics are actually one of these things that you study that naturally makes you study so many other disciplines by itself. So people, if they're doing research on psychedelics, they're probably already engaging in some type of interdisciplinary exposure to psychedelics, I would think, in some way. But as far as increasing the collaboration between these, I'm not sure if there's certain groups that are like think groups, or people that come together from different disciplines to create a kind of a collaborative intellectual environment to exchange ideas. I think there's a websites like Psychedelic Science Review, right? Like, they don't include anthropology, they don't include some things, but they try to bring scientific knowledge to a popular audiences, kind of disseminate it to a popular audience, and then perhaps that popular audience, can understand what's happening at these levels of, they run into paywalls. They can't access the journals, even if they can read them. And then if they can actually read the journal, which is a tall task for most people. Like, we've been trained to do this. Unfortunately, it's been really difficult to train you to read an article or even write an article. It's like a terrible process. But yeah, I mean, like, I think those are ways that we can reach the public, giving, public lectures. I don't know. It has to have, people have to have the intention too of wanting to.
Yeah. Well, actually, I just, very last brief question, I promise.
No worries.
You said something I need to ask now. What do you think is, what does it mean to come out of the psychedelic closet? What is the purpose of it? Because coming out of like a closet about sexuality can open more spaces to get real rights for real people right now. So then, what are the goals of a movement in which you're trying to come out of the psychedelic closet?
I mean, I don't know, like, I mean, it still entails a lot of stigma. It still entails a lot of dehumanization. I mean, I got a research grant from the Source Research Foundation, which is only for psychedelic research. And they gave me a grant to do my dissertation work, but nobody else was probably going to fund me. So in a lot of these institutional, you know, I don't know, I applied for a Ford Foundation. We'll see if I get it. But I know that just as soon as somebody sees the word psychedelic, it already is like, whoa, wait, like an engineer or somebody from some other field that's not anywhere related to anthropology, they're going to maybe see that word and immediately think, you know, we're not going to fund this person, right? So I think that, you know, I don't know, I'm in the process right now of like, you know, I mean, speaking about my own psychedelic use is not something I've done very much, like only in very certain context, because in my master's thesis, even at my advisor was like very strict, and I wrote like an experience report that was mine as if it was somebody else's. That was my way of like kind of getting around it.
Yeah.
And I don't even know if that's ethically sound or what. I mean, but there's one in there that, yeah, it was my experience. I was like, you know what? It's super important. I need to include my experience in this, because why not? I mean, I'm the person investigating this, right? And so, but it's also like you have to like check yourself, because like I've tried to speak about my own experiences, but then I read all these experience reports and I do all these interviews, and I'm like, none of those experiences were anything like mine. And so really, I can't talk about my experience as if other people can learn from it, or that they should value it like they value mine, because they're not me. And whatever goes on in my head and my imagination is so different than what's happening in somebody else's mind, body, and their imagination and their life history, that I can't even, you know. So there's this, I don't know, this incommensurability, or I don't know what you would call it, between different psychedelic experiences, that sometimes we can find these points of similarity that we can collaborate on, but at the same time, like, it's super hard to be like, yeah, my psychedelic experience was like so mind expanding, and I saw the infinite potential that's inside of me, and like I might tell that to somebody that might have a terrible heart rip, and like, so I don't know. I mean, I've been trying to be more careful about how I talk about psychedelics in general.
They definitely like bring to the fore, you know, the problem of other minds in a way that becomes like very real and immediate, because it's like, well, normally we can all just call something green, and it really like does not matter, like if it's the same green at ever, except, you know, all of a sudden when you know, there's a few kids and you're like, do you see that? And everyone's like, what? So yeah, anyway, I would love to continue talking to you, but I have to let you go now. Thank you so much. This was so fascinating. I'm really grateful for all of the time that you gave us today.
Thank you. And thank you for, you know, the people that are still here listening. I appreciate you, and I value you. Thank you for listening to me talk for such a long time.
It was our pleasure. All right, guys, thank you so much for coming, everyone. And thank you for staying, everyone who did. Like, wow, great. I will see you guys all in a month for our next speaker, April 13th. Come through. All right, bye.
Thanks, bye.